This video is going to talk about the role of expectations in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. This is a topic covered in chapter 18. And we're going to do it. I'm going to do it a little differently than they do in the textbook. The textbook authors introduced what's known as the Phillips curve, which is a curve that relates unemployment and output. Unemployment and inflation. Now, inflation is really just a change in the price level, and unemployment is related to output. So, although they introduced the Phillips curve, and I think at this point in time, the Phillips curve is primarily for historical purposes because in the 1950s and 60s, in the 1960s, it was part of Keynesian models at the time. Now, we have the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework, and since unemployment is just in some sense, the flip side of output, I don't think there's a lot that's really new or that's being added to here with the Phillips curve other than giving you another graph to attempt to try to understand. So we're going to not really worry about the Phillips curve, but there's a story that the authors tell that talk about the role of expectations that they use the Phillips curve to talk about, but you can actually do that with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework. So we're drawing in here is a long-run aggregate supply curve and three different short-run aggregate supply curves. Now, we know in chapter 13, when we introduced the idea when we introduced this model, we know that short-run aggregate supply curves are positively sloped because some prices, most often like wages, end up getting fixed. They are set in this model. They don't adjust quickly. So some prices are fixed, but they have to be fixed at a level. Now, what level are you going to fix these prices at? Well, it turns out it's going to be the expectations are driving this. It's going to be the price level that people in the economy expect to see prevail. And the way to make sense of this is that let's consider the price level that each of these different short-run aggregate supply, the price level at which each of these different short-run aggregate supply curves intersect the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is drawn here on Y bar, the full employment output level. SRAS intersects at the lowest price level that I've labeled P1. SRAS 2 is farther up and it intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve at P2. And then SRAS 3 is the highest or the one most to the left. Here it intersects the long-run aggregate supply curve at P3. The way to think about it is that each of these different short-run aggregate supply curves are based on people expecting the price level to be at a certain given level. SRAS1 is really based on the expectation that the price level in the economy is going to be P1, because that's really in effect, when you're going to set some prices or wages in advance of how long they're going to be fixed for, you have to think about what level do you want to set them at. So especially with wages, if you want to think, people want to try to get their real wage, and real wage depends on, which is adjusted for inflation. The real wage depends on both the nominal wage, the wage that's set in the contract, and then what the price level ends up being at. So you're forming some expectation, or you're making a guess as to what level do you expect to see prices at during the period of time in which you have to fix the wages or fix other prices. And for SRAS1, the way to think about it is SRAS1 is geared to people expecting that the price level is going to be P1. When the price level turns out to be P1, that's when with SRAS1, we have the full employment level of output produced. So SRAS1 gives us Y bar at P1. SRAS2 gives us Y bar at P2. So that's the price level, in effect, that SRAS2 would be based on. Of course, then once you lock in some of those prices and wages and they're fixed, if the price level turns out to be higher than P2, then you'll move up. The SRAS curve is positively sloped, so that's how you get out here to the level of output above Y bar. But SRAS2 gives us long-run, the full employment long-run level of output at P2, and SRAS3 gives us full employment output at the price level P3. So you can really think of every short run aggregate supply curve is based on a level of price assumptions, a price level that people assume are going to apply or expect to apply. And that gets to the term of expectations. So it's expectations of the price level that people are using when they're setting these wage contracts, or you're setting the prices in the Sears catalog, whatever prices you can't adjust very easily because of menu costs and other factors, whatever prices you have to lock in for a period of time, you lock them in based on your expectations of the price level. And these short run aggregate supply curves reflect the price level that people expect to prevail during the period of time that you have to lock these prices in place. Well, beginning in at the end of the 1960s and 1970s, macroeconomists started to actually think seriously about what was going on here and realize that there's expectations of the price level that are driving here. And then what it turned out was we had to start thinking very carefully about how expectations were being set in the model. And it turned out, as economists started to think about it, it turned out that Keynesian models of the 1960s were using what were called adaptive expectations. Adaptive expectations is really just forecasting the future based on the past. But it would be like taking the average temperature over the last 5 days, and you see what the average is, and then that's going to be your forecast, what you think the temperature is going to be the next day. And if you want, you might even weight you might do a weighted average where okay, you put more weight on what the temperature was the day before. A very, very simple version of adaptive expectations would be simply what's known as persistence. Whatever the temperature level was the day before, that's the temperature you expect today. So whatever, with persistence, which is an extreme form of adaptive expectations, you say, if the price level was P1 last period, we'll assume it's going to be P1 again this year, this next period, or this next year. Again, adaptive expectations might be saying well, you take the average of the price levels over the last 3 years, and that's your forecast. Those are not unreasonable ways to forecast, and in some circumstances that will work very well. Many times in weather forecasting, a persistence forecast actually does pretty darn well, and it is not a bad forecast. You can do worse than forecasting persistence, simply because in the weather, when you're having a hot spell, if it was 95 degrees yesterday, it's probably going to be 95 again today. If you're having a cold spell, if it's cold yesterday, it might well be cold again today. So, adaptive expectations in some cases is not a bad way to model things. But what some economists start propose as an alternative is that, well, maybe what we should be assuming is that when people are forming expectations in this model, that they're forming their expectations what we're called rationally. Now, when you're building a model, getting into a lot more detail in the models than we want to get into. What this would technically mean was that you use all the information available in this model to say, well, what would be the expected value of this variable in this model? Or in other words, as a principle, people should use all of the information that's available to them. And think of, again, take the example of expecting what the weather is. Well, I mean, if it's January here in Alabama, most days it's not all that cold, and so if it's been in the 50s for highs recently, that's not too bad. You could just wear a sweatshirt. You don't necessarily need a coat, especially if you don't get cold. I get cold, but and so you might you might look and inform your expectations adaptively and say, okay, it's been, the average temperature the last 3 days has been in the 50s. Well, I'll just wear a sweatshirt and not wear a coat today. But you might also know that a cold front went through last night. Or you might look at the weather forecast and they told you that a cold front was going to go through overnight and that the high temperature tomorrow was going to be 35, not 55. That would be one idea of what's behind rational expectations. So there's more information. You're not going to limit yourself to only. You're not going to limit yourself to only saying like, well, what was the temperature yesterday? We'll expect that. And sometimes that's a good forecast. Other times when you know, like, oh, a cold front just went through, and you can see the wind. You look out your window and you see the wind blowing from the north, and you might guess that it's going to be cold, and maybe you look at the forecast or whatever. Sometimes you can do better. And the idea of rational expectations was that in our models, in our macro models, we should be letting people form the best expectations that they could. Why is that? Well, in part because this is a model economy, but it matters for people whether they set these prices at the right level. If you're a worker and you expect the price level to be P1 and you accept a wage based on that, and the price level turns out to be higher than P1, you will be worse off. Your real wage will not be what you thought it would be. So when people make mistakes forecasting the price in this model, it would be painful, because if we think about what's happening in the real world, this is what in the book they talk about unexpected inflation, and how unexpected inflation or unexpected deflation, if inflation isn't as high as you expect it to be, that ends up causing real losses, real hardship, some real pain for people. They don't want to make that mistake. And so the idea of rational expectations was to say, in our models, we need to make sure that people are forming expectations using all the relevant information, which again means that sometimes, like, you're not going to rely on persistence because a cold front just went through. And although it was nice and balmy yesterday, it's going to be really cold out there today, and you're going to freeze your knees if you didn't bring your winter coat, if you didn't break out your coat for today. And to just say, like, because it's costly to people, they should be using all of the available information. Although that sounds non-controversial, and some of it's not non-controversial, it turned out, as macroeconomists started exploring this through, it had a huge impact on the what happens in the model. And so, although it seems like this was called like the rational expectations revolution, but it really, the thing that highlighted more than anything else was how important the role of expectations were in these macroeconomic models. And that's really important because, at one level, if expectations didn't end up mattering very much in the model, well, then whether people are using adaptive expectations or rational expectations may not mean so much. But if you get completely and radically different results out of the same model when you change how people are forming their expectations, then you really have to look carefully and try to say, like, well, what's going on here? Because it's letting you understand that, like, what's really important in these models are how people are forming their expectations. So again, this is how we can think about this, and without using the Phillips curve, we can do this with just the ADAS model. And again, it shows a very important development that occurred in macroeconomics back in the 1970s, and how it is that we have to pay a lot of attention to how people are forming their forecasts or expectations.